One of the first things, actually, Dr. Rod, that you shared was something that you were inspired, or that impacted you from these midterm elections as a lot. Is obviously both you and I, we follow a few key, let's call them YouTubers or media influencers, whatever, that are political commentators themselves. I'm not going to name and shame any of them, but you addressed today that it's quite interesting how the people that are meant to be conservatives tend to be a little bit more biased, and they're quite openly honest about their biases towards, center right. But it's you brought up the point of it's amazing how negative they are, and that we as leaders, if we're trying to influence and become better leaders ourselves and try to become a positive influence on the world, it's pretty difficult when all we're doing is being negative. Because I saw some of the commentators today speaking about what's happening in these midterm elections from really such a negative, and actually even one, like I said, I'm not going to name and shame. He even turned around today and said, today was a negative podcast because I'm just in a bad mood because it should have been a different result. Dr. Rod, how should we or how can we present ourselves in a way where we can still be strong with our views, but not be negative?
Well, it's a big challenge, and I suppose I should first make it very clear that I am conservative with a small c.
Yeah.
I'm a Pentecostal pastor, so you would expect that. I believe that the Bible is God's truth, and so my attitude towards most of the issues that we discuss are very strongly based on biblical principles. So people need to know that right up front. Secondly, of course, this is a leadership podcast, and of course, even in the context that we're talking today, we're still looking at what lessons can we learn in terms of improving our leadership. And as you said, Craig, I shared with you off air my feeling that so many of the conservative commentators have really been very, very negative over a long period of time. And one of the things I've noticed, because I do follow a lot of conservative commentators, both here in Australia and in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, and I certainly do agree broadly with their diagnosis of what the issues are.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, the far left are in the ascendant, and they're almost certainly sort of influenced by cultural Marxism, and that's been going on for a long time now. It certainly goes back to the early 20th century, and the momentum has been building steadily since around about the 1970s. And so what we're observing is the culmination of a process that's been going on really for 100 years. And more or less at the same time that that's been going on, the influence of Christianity has been declining, at least in the Western world. That is not true in some other parts of the world. But in the Western world, in the higher income countries, the influence of Christianity has been declining. And one of the things I've noticed about many of the commentators is that they are incredibly negative. And by the way, they're not all Christians. Many of them are openly atheistic, but they are conservative. What I've noticed is they're very, very good at being able to articulate what is wrong with the policies that are being implemented and what is wrong with the worldview held by the people who have most influence in the development of the policies. But what they don't do very well, in my view, is offer an actual solution.
Yeah.
And I think as leaders, it's one thing for us to identify issues, to identify problems. In other words, it's good for us to be good at the diagnostic side of things, but we also have to have the vision to be able to offer solutions. And I think one of the issues that we've seen in this particular election is that the conservative commentators have been pretty good at saying there's a lot wrong with what's going on at the moment, And really their only solution has been to vote differently.
Yeah.
And I doubt that that's been all that persuasive, because really to convince people to vote differently, you've really got to offer them something that is different. And I'm not convinced that we've been offering people a really good, solid alternative.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would go so far as to say, and I need to be careful in saying this, and really this is probably more of a hypothesis at the moment than anything. I do wonder whether the very negative approach taken by the conservative commentators, including those who are Christian, actually has an influence in the spiritual realm,
Yeah.
and that does affect the outcomes of things like the midterm elections. That's just food for thought,
Yeah.
something perhaps people might like to discuss once this video is published.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you hear these, let's say these conservative commentators that do lots of tours and speeches and everything like that, and they talk down about the protesters that come to their events that are all negative, that they're like, we're just here to present a thought, and the other people, they won't even hear the discussion, they're just negative, and there's all this attack against, let's call it the left, that they can't handle discussions, they're just being negative, and they just throw insults, everything like that. Well, when you watch a lot of the conservative commentators, they too are just throwing mud, so to speak, from their own platform, you know. Now, we discussed earlier off air that, yeah, look, it's okay if you're quite overtly that you're like, I'm a conservative and we are a conservative platform and that's what we're presenting, you know, like that's okay, because people can share their own thoughts and everything like that. But I think it's interesting that it's very easy for us to judge someone else for what they're doing wrong, and in that judging, we too are doing almost the same thing that we are judging them for.
Yes, in a large to a large extent, I think that that's true. That the way to counter mudslinging is not necessarily to sling mud as well.
Yes.
And I think it's fine to couch a discussion in terms of, look, we actually fundamentally disagree with the approach being taken because our worldviews are different, the way in which we interpret what goes on in the world is different, and here are some solutions. And these are solutions which ought to be offered up by a political alternative.
Yes.
So, to take one of the big discussions in the United States, of course, has been the change in the High Court's attitude towards abortion. Now, on one level, all it does is shift responsibility back to the states, where many people would say that it always was a state responsibility to define the law on abortion, and all that the High Court did in the United States was to restore the right of individual states to make up their minds, and that for sure is true. But then I haven't heard any of these commentators discuss things like the role that domestic violence plays in abortion.
Mm.
I think we need, us on the conservative side, we need to acknowledge, for example, that there are many women who are forced into abortion, for example, because they are victims of domestic violence. And we know that domestic violence increases when a woman becomes pregnant.
Mm.
And so many seek abortions because they hope that might protect them from further abuse, further violence. What are we offering to help those women, or to make those women feel that they will still be safe in a different legal environment? These are the sorts of things I mean by we have to be able to offer an alternative solution. So I think it's great that we're saying, look, we want to protect life. Life begins at conception, and therefore abortion is murder. I agree with all of that.
Mm.
But what are we offering to the individuals who find themselves in a position where they believe that the only way out for them, because, for example, they're victims of domestic violence, the only way out for them is an abortion.
Yeah.
So, we need to be able to offer solutions. Now, actually, the long-term solution is stable marriage
Yeah.
between a man and a wife. And we
Yep.
know
Healthy,
that's
stable
what the
marriage.
data show, that the safest place for a woman is within the boundaries, as it were, of traditional marriage. It's also the safest place for children. So we need to be saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put a lot of effort and resources into making marriages better,
Yeah.
making marriage a viable option for many people who at the moment don't think it is. So we need to offer solutions like that. We need to offer solutions to the high cost of energy. And one of the things that interested me during many of the debates in relation to the midterm elections in the United States was, and I may be quite wrong because I'm in Australia, I don't hear everything, but I didn't hear a solid commitment to becoming self-sufficient in energy again.
Yeah.
Now, I could be totally wrong on that, but I would have thought
there
that
wasn't much of that. Obviously, I'm
didn't seem to be.
I'm closer to there,
No.
and there didn't seem to be much comment on that. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, like, something that I wrote down as you were talking, I think it's the difference between being critical and analytical.
That's a good point.
I agree with
if
you. We just be critical and criticize people, we're no better than anyone else, right? We're not adding any value to the conversation. We're not, one thing that you and I spoke about just before this is some of the comments that we're getting on our YouTube videos. There's some of them that are just critical of something, of either you or I or what we're talking about, and they've completely missed what we're actually discussing. We're discussing about how we can become better leaders, and even there were some of the comments that were almost in direct contradiction to exactly what we shared, and it's just because some people are just bent on being critical, right? I'm gonna keyboard warriors and everything like that, and I suppose, as a bit of a side note, guys, if you're getting anything positive from these videos, if you're learning anything about your leadership, if you're being personally challenged with your leadership, put a comment below. Let's fill the comments below with positivity, with encouragement, with hey, I learned this, or this really made me think about that. Wouldn't that be a better environment rather than just being critical, right? Let's be analytical, because I think that that's what should set us apart as great leaders. Is a leader that just goes around and criticizes everything. We all know them. It's a negative environment to work in. It's a bad place to be a part of. Like, people don't flourish in those sorts of, and we all know leaders like that. We also have all been leaders like that. I know that I can find myself to be very critical. But I suppose a bit of a revelation, as we've been discussing this, Dr. Rod, is making that transition from just being critical to being analytical. It's the shift of what I believe is, like you said, is finding a solution or looking at it objectively and trying to figure out and having an open mind and looking at all the facts, because that's what you do when you analyze something. You look at all the facts and you try to draw in as much information as you can. Dr. Rod, you've always got a bit of a story to share about your leadership experience. What's a time when you've experienced, or you yourself have been critical versus analytical, or made the shift yourself?
Well, certainly before I became a Christian, I was Mr. Critical. I was the kind of person who always blamed someone else or blamed circumstances for my own the own state that I was in, or whatever I was experiencing myself. And, I had many, many years of practice. So
Mm-hmm.
I got pretty good at it. But I think once I became a Christian, I began to understand things quite differently. And that is like when people hurt me or did something I didn't like, it was more sin than anything else. And sin undermines everything,
Yeah.
and we have to understand that a lot of what's going on in our world today is really the outcome of sin.
Yep.
And I've become very, very conscious, I should say, conscious in recent years that we need to think generously,
Mm.
speak generously, and act generously even in a context where we're dealing with people with whom we have deep, deep disagreements.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly have deep disagreements with politicians and others, of course, who believe in abortion up until birth and euthanasia and many, many other things. But I think I've come to understand that we live in a world which is marred by sin.
Mm.
And we certainly live in a world in which love is growing cold, that agape love, the God type of love is growing cold, even among Christians. And that often shows up in the comments we make publicly about others. And certainly that happens in the context of politics, but it happens in other contexts as well. So look, I think I'm becoming better at the art of loving those I perceive to be my enemies and understanding that their wrong thinking is really a reflection of the state of the world, the fact that we live in a fallen world.
Yeah.
But also, I do feel more and more responsible for not only pointing out or diagnosing issues and problems, but also finding solutions. Now,
Yeah.
ultimately, the answer to all our questions is Jesus.
Yeah.
But like in the public square, we can't say the answer to all of humanity's problems is Jesus
Yeah.
because that sounds stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be received as such by people who really don't know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
For me, Jesus responded to the disciples when they asked him, what will be the signs of the end of the age? And that's all set out in Matthew 24 and 25. And I think we're living in those times now. So we're getting very, very close to end times. As David Jeremiah says, we shouldn't be thinking it's the end of the world. We should be thinking that we're living in the world of the end. And I think that's a very wise statement.
Yeah.
And we should frame our own thinking of the world in that context. We're living in the world of the end. And so what we're seeing around us shouldn't really surprise us, nor should it cause us to fear.
Yeah.
We should maintain our confidence in the truth of God's word, maintain our confidence and our hope in the promises of God's word. And in the meantime, we need to be in the world, but
Yeah.
not of the world.
Yeah.
We need to fearlessly and steadfastly state our position. And yes, we should be putting up our alternatives in the political realm as well as every other realm.
Yeah.
So, our area, our chosen area is leadership. So we need to continue to diagnose and teach on leadership
Yeah.
because we want better leadership in the world. And ultimately, of course, your big, hairy, audacious goal is to rid the world of poor leadership.
Yeah.
So everything that we do, even on this podcast, should be pointing people towards better leadership based on the examples that we see in everyday life around us. Now, I don't know whether that's really answered the question, but it
No, it has.
did give me an opportunity to say something that's on my heart.
That's good. No, we never know where these things are going. That's okay. It's a discussion. You emphasize the fact that you didn't always be analytical. You have been critical. I would echo the same, that I actually feel like, the idea of there's two edges to one sword, right? That some things, like, so for example, a box of matches is great, but it can also be dangerous, right? And I believe that that happens with our gifts. And in our leadership program, we actually talk about, the balconies and basements, or the advantages and disadvantages, or the challenges and opportunities from each of our gifts or callings or whatever. And yeah, that bit of a shameless plug, leadership program, free leadership program down below. Go check it out. The being critical is the same gift as being analytical, but it's just used obviously in a negative way, where I believe one gift that God has given me is been able to identify issues and find solutions for it. However, when I'm in a selfish mindset, or maybe in a bad mood, or in a place of lack, or in a place where I'm more self-focused, I can be really critical, and not analytical. And it's affected my relationships in the past, because I've been over critical rather than being analytical, It's hurt me when, I look back to some of my earlier leadership roles. I was really good at identifying problems, and so I kind of felt that was my job to call out the problems, but without finding a solution for them, or without offering a solution for them. And I can see that as I have matured in life and in leadership, that making that transition from critical to analytical has made me a better leader, but also made me more tolerable, to live with, and to be around. It's much more enjoyable to be around someone who's analytical rather than critical. So please, let us encourage you as a leader. Be warned about being critical about the things that are around you. Let's shift that to being analytical and trying to figure out how we can then use that to find solutions, discuss alternatives to whatever it is that we're facing, rather than just being negative and critical. And remember, this podcast, as we've kind of mentioned a few times, is about us trying to be analytical. Remember, we're not being critical of the person. And we've also mentioned a couple of times here about on a mission to eradicate poor leadership. That's not the person. We're not here to eradicate people, right? And it's the poor leadership is not about the person, it's about the behavior. And that's us being analytical rather than critical, because we're not criticizing a person. We're analyzing the events and finding how we, from what we know, can be better leaders. Hey, that was an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If your leadership has been challenged, helped, or you've gotten a new revelation around your leadership, give it a thumbs up, and we'd love to hear your comments below. And hey, if you want to see more content like this, check out our channel and consider subscribing.